Welcome to our series, Faithful Regardless. We are studying the book of 1 Samuel and seeing the adventures of King David before he was king. In fact, he was being chased around by the king Saul, who has already become murderously jealous of David and is making all kinds of horrible mistakes. Last chapter, David spared Saul. He had the opportunity to kill him a second time. And once again, David spared him. Saul momentarily repented, thanked David, and declared a blessing upon David. But Saul's heart has not changed. And now David is faced again with an opportunity to be faithful regardless. And normally in the last 3 chapters, he had those opportunities and he passed the test. This time, he did not. This time, David enlists himself in the army of the Philistines because he's finding he's desperate. He has no home. He has no way of provision. And so David is trying to find a way to provide for himself and his army of men. So believe it or not, he goes to the army of the Philistines and enlists the whole army in the Philistines' service. Yeah, the Philistines, the enemy. Saul was no better. Saul was trying to find something from God, but he had been so disobedient to God. His heart was so callous to God that he didn't hear God. So he did something equally as preposterous. He went to find a source to help him find counsel, and he went to the Witch of Endor. The Witch of Endor, who calls up Samuel, who has already been dead. This is kind of a crazy chapter. It's actually going to span 2 chapters, chapter 27 and 28. So this is David and Saul both choosing fear over faith and their own personal security over seeking God. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 27 of 1 Samuel. But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I could do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me everywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. Let me just say this. It was not God's best to him to have multiple wives. He already had a wife, Michal of Saul, the daughter of Saul, but that was given to another man when David disappeared from Saul's service. David had married Abigail of Carmel just a couple chapters ago, but we don't know if he maybe was concerned that he couldn't have children with her, so he went ahead and got another wife. Verse 4, it says this, when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Gizurites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived in the land extending to Shur in Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, and clothes, and then he returned to Achish. But when Achish asked, where did you go raiding today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, against the Negev of Jerahmeel, against the Negev of the Kenites. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform us and say, this is what David did. And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he may be my servant for life. And you see what's happening here? David is fighting battles for the Philistines. And he's actually going against their common enemies, but he's coming back and telling them that he's fighting those of his own tribes of Judah or the allied tribes of the Kenites and things like that. So he's lying about who he's conquering to Achish. And Achish, the king of the Philistines, is saying, wow, he's become so repulsive or obnoxious, repugnant to his people by doing this. He'll have to serve me for the rest of his life. David is in a very unkingly and unnoble predicament. Chapter 28 starts this way. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your men will accompany me in my army. And David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. Achish replied, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. You see, Achish, the Philistine, says, okay, David, now let's fight your people. You could be at my side fighting your people with me to prove. And David said, well, let's see what your servant can do. And Achish said, okay, David, I will give you a royal position. Your life will have significance. You could be my bodyguard for life. How about that? You see, David was only trying to make a living, provide for his family, give them work. But this occupation of being a mercenary for the Philistines was far below the calling God had for him. He was forfeiting the calling that God had for him. This is not what the soon-to-be king of Israel was supposed to be about at this part in his life. He didn't seek God in these days. You don't see him seeking the Lord and the Lord telling him to do this. He didn't ask Abiathar, the priest, to inquire of the Lord for him. That won't happen until chapter 30. In fact, in chapter 30, the consequences roll out, where David has been given this city of Ziklag, and he's fighting as mercenary soldier for the Philistines against the Amalekites. And the Amalekites came and attacked that city, burned it to the ground, and took all the wives and children of David and his men captive. That's consequence. But David, we'll get to that chapter. At one point, David did recover them without harm, but still, this is a response. This is the result of David seeking his own way rather than seeking the Lord. And this is just one of the consequences David suffered, pursuing his own way instead of seeking God. The other was probably closer to his heart in terms of his long-lasting legacy. And that was his lifelong passion. You see, David's decisions to use his gifts and talents for bloodshed rather than pursuing the things of God cost him the one true dream that he had for Jerusalem: building the temple. That was David's passion. He wanted to build a temple for perpetual worship of the Lord, a temple that could be the headquarters, the center pin, if you will, of God's presence here on earth. That was David's passion, but God would not allow it. God wouldn't allow him to be the one to build the temple because he considered David disqualified for this work. Why? Because of the bloodshed that David participated in the many years he fought. Instead, that privilege was not given to David. It was given to his son, Solomon. That's why it's called Solomon's Temple. We read about this in 1 Chronicles 22, 7 through 8. David said to Solomon, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on earth in my sight." You see all this bloodshed that David was participating in? Not bloodshed that the Lord directed him. He wasn't seeking the Lord at this time in his life in chapters 27 and 28. It was just bloodshed, and this action had consequences. Our actions have consequences, friends. Even if we're forgiven, we could do something really horrific, really egregious. Ask God for forgiveness, and he will forgive us. But the Bible is true. The principle is true that we reap what we sow. We will have, oftentimes, very serious consequences for our actions. You see, even when we do wrong, we can be forgiven, but the wrongdoing will yield wrong fruit or bad fruit. And the things we do and don't do will have a direct effect on the rewards or consequences that we experience even years afterwards. And David chose not to trust God in this time, but to put his faith in man, or really himself. He resigned himself to use his time and his talents just for making a living or providing for himself, not for what was God's best for him. Now, yeah, it temporarily paid the bills. Hey, he got a city to live in. Yeah, it temporarily gave his men something to do. But as a result of this, he suffered stress. He wasted time. A year and 4 months of David's life wasted, and sadly forfeited one of his most cherished dreams, building the temple. So how can we learn from this? What can we learn from the life of David? Do we trust God? Do we trust him for his purposes and his provision? That If we pursue him, he will provide. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added. Or are we doing the opposite, trusting ourselves, trusting our own self-sufficiency? You see, trust is faith. And faith is God's love language. It's what he wants from us. Faith in him. Trust is faith. The opposite of that is fear. Both Saul and David in these 2 chapters chose fear over faith. But what about Saul? Let's talk about him. Saul's heart had become so hardened, and his spiritual eyes had become so blind that he could not hear the Lord. He would seek the Lord but not hear anything. He couldn't wholeheartedly seek the Lord because of the posture of the evil in his heart. So instead of humbling himself and waiting on the Lord and offering proper sacrifices and seeking God's face, he too, just like David, took things into his own hands. He decided, well, I'll get the answer my own way. If God won't speak, I'll make something happen. And he decided to call upon the Witch of Endor. That's what the Bible calls her. She's a spiritist, a woman. But she's known as the Witch of Endor. And to try to seek counsel from Samuel, who, by the way, was already dead. Samuel had died. So instead of Saul waiting on God, seeking God, humbling himself, offering the sacrifices for his sin, repenting, changing the posture of his heart, he said, forget it with you, God. I'll go and speak to someone that's been my friend, even though they died. I'll find a witch to help me do it. You know that's not going to end well. 1 Samuel 28:3, now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him, and buried him in his own town of Ramah. And Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. These were people that we hear that are trying to reach the dead, trying to find answers from the grave. Even people like our current modern day fortune tellers and spiritual advisors and psychics, things like that. Saul had expelled them from the land. Verse 4, the Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel and came up from Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror fills his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or the prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, find me a woman who is a medium, so I can go and inquire of her. There is one in Endor, they said. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. Consult a spirit for me, he said, and bring up for me the one I name. But the woman said to him, surely you know that Saul has done what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death? Saul swore to her by the Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this. You see, he's sneaking around. He's pretending he's just a common man, probably a man of wealth, and trying to get her to do something that's already been forbidden. Verse 11, then the woman asked, whom shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel, he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, don't be afraid. What do you see? The woman said, I see a ghostly figure coming up out of earth. What does he look like? He asked. An old man wearing a robe is coming up, she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. And Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I am in great distress, Saul said. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me either by prophets or by dreams, so I have called on you to tell me what to do. And Samuel said, why do you consult me now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Wow, what a dire prophecy. It's not what Saul was hoping to hear. Now, I just want to say, by the way, this is the only time in Scripture that we see this. We don't know why or how, But this scripture in no way condones the use of psychics and spiritual advisors and fortune tellers for us to find answers. Their source is not God. Their source is not even a deceased prophet or, saint or loved one that's gone before. They are not hearing that voice. If they're hearing any voice or persuasion or influence, it's the devil. It's demonic. And if you seek answers from these people, here's what you're doing. You're seeking answers from deceived people who are looking for the deceiver to help you guide your life. That will not end well, I promise. But we don't know why or how God gave Samuel the ability to speak through the grave. Even though Saul was disguising himself, even though this is a witch or a spiritist, it wasn't really the kosher way of hearing prophecy. But Samuel was a prophet and somehow was able to prophesy from the grave. And it's the only time, like I said, that this type of thing takes place. This is a prophetic message that came from Samuel from beyond the grave, who knows how. But it was accurate, and it did come to pass, and it was not what Saul wanted to hear. Basically, it had 4 parts. Here's the message. The Lord has departed from you and become your enemy. 2, the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands. 3, the Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines. And 4, you and your sons will die tomorrow. Basically, it'll be your worst nightmare, and you'll all be dead by this time tomorrow. So what happens? Verse 20, immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and all that night. When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, "Look, your servant has obeyed you. I took my life into my own hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant and let me give you some food so that you may eat it and have the strength to go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fatted calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, baked bread without yeast, and she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. And that same night they got up and they left. Now Saul's sin of self-sufficiency didn't just show it up here. It started early in his life. And it led to many grave mistakes, serious mistakes with serious consequences. And God had not forgotten the sin of rebellion. When Saul displayed, when he just mentioned, he did not carry out God's wrath against the Amalekites. That was his one job, to rid the world of these evil invaders. And he didn't do it. Back in 1 Samuel 15, Saul chose to keep the Amalekite king alive, take all of their plunder, rather than destroy everything that God had commanded. And Samuel confronted him about this. And Saul said, "What do you mean? I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers, they were the ones that took the sheep and cattle, the best of what was devoted to God, so that they could offer sacrifices." Yeah, that's what they were doing. Samuel was not believing it. Saul was not being truthful. His intent was to disregard this very serious mission that the Lord had put him on, the command of the Lord that the Lord put him on, and follow what? His own desires, do it his own way. And Saul answered in verse 22 of 1 Samuel 15, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice." Samuel said to obey is better than sacrifice. And Saul did not obey the Lord, and it turned out to be a very important test in his life that he failed, and that once again Samuel is reminding him of from beyond the grave. And his next test, it was almost like God gave Saul the ability to try to redeem himself, but he messed up that one too. Both of these. In 1 Samuel 13, it was Saul and his armies were waiting for Samuel to arrive, and the instructions were this: wait in Gilgal 7 days till I arrive. I'll offer a sacrifice. Then you go out and you'll be able to fight the Philistines. But Saul in his own way said, "You know what? I've waited 7 days. I'm not going to wait for Samuel. I'm not going to have him do the sacrifice. You know what? Even though it's forbidden, I'll do it. I'll do it my own way. And Saul went ahead and did the sacrifice. When Samuel got there, he said this, "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the Lord's command, the command that the Lord gave you." Why was this offering a sacrifice so foolish? Because Saul had disobeyed the Lord. Saul had disobeyed the Lord. He barely waited 7 days, and when he didn't see Samuel, he decided to do it on his own way, his own self-sufficiency, his own self-reliance, his own disregard for God's command. And this is why the Lord departed from him. This is why he could no longer hear God when he sought him superficially. And once again, the consequences were very great. It was at that time that Samuel gave Saul this very, very serious and severe prophecy. 1 Samuel 13:13. "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command of the Lord that he gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart and appointed him as ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's commands." Guys, we got to learn from this. All this stuff. We have to learn from David. We have to learn from Saul. Self-reliance, self-sufficiency, what are they? They're forms of rebellion. They really are. When God tells you to do one thing and you do another, what does it show? It shows lack of faith, lack of trust. It shows a total disregard for God and his commands. Saying, "God, yeah, thanks for the suggestion, but I'm going to do it my way. I know more than you. I can figure out this situation better. I'm more equipped to establish the navigation of my life than you are." Almost like keep out. Keep your mouth shut, God. I'm doing things my way. And it's rooted in pride. It's very similar to the first sin. You know what the first sin was? First sin wasn't apple eating. What was behind the sin of eating the forbidden fruit? In Genesis 3:2-5, it says this, "The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat from the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die.'" Pretty simple. In verse 4, it says, "You will not die. You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." You see, the devil was saying something that was the opposite of God, and they had to choose who they believed. And guess what they chose? God was telling them, "Trust me, obey my word, and I will take care of you." The devil was saying, "Don't trust God, eat of the tree, and you can be like God, and you can just trust yourself." And that's what they did. That sin, their sin, was that they disobeyed the Lord so that they could be like God, free to do their own thing, their own way, and trust in themselves and not have to trust in God. Very similar to what David did, very obviously similar to what Saul did. In the case of David and Saul, if they had trusted God and waited on him to speak, waited on him to provide, waited on him to show them what they were to do, well, these sins would not have taken place, and very likely the dire consequences of those sins would not have taken place either. They would have been avoided. See, the Bible is very clear on what we are to do. Solomon said it so well, so famously. Proverbs 3:5-6. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all your ways, and he will direct your paths." But what happens when we don't trust God with all our heart, and we do lean on our own understanding? We're all tempted to do that. We don't trust God, and we do lean on our own understanding. Well, we wind up like David and Saul, and we suffer the consequences of relying on our own self-sufficiency instead of trusting God. You see, trust is the opposite of faith. Trust, the opposite of trust and the opposite of faith is fear. See, trust is exactly the same as faith. That's what I meant to say. They're both from the same word. In fact, in the New Testament, the word is pistis, same Greek word for trust and faith. They're interchangeable. You can use them that way. But disobeying God, relying on your own self-sufficiency, that's the opposite of trusting God, and it's the opposite of faith. I know it's hard because like David, we want to provide. We want to know how God's going to provide. And when we don't see him providing, we find our own way to make a living. We find our own way to pay our bills, to feed our families, to establish something with the work of our hands in the time we have. It's tempting. And we're sometimes like David, trying to find provision, and we are tempted to go outside of God's will, and sometimes, like David did, outside of God's kingdom to find a way to provide for ourselves. And like Saul, it could be hard. We grow impatient. Sometimes we seek the Lord for a clear answer, and we don't get it right away. And we feel we need it right now. We need God to show us right now, and he doesn't show us right now. And we're not sure where to turn and what to do, and it could be tempting to look outside of the Word of God. Sometimes it's tempting to look to other sources other than God, advice from friends, and maybe in worst cases, you're seeking the answers you're supposed to get from God. You're seeking it from a spiritual advisor or a fortune teller or something like that. It's tempting, but it's so important to trust God and wait on God. If we trust him, we will wait on him, and if we call upon him, we have to know that he will answer us. He will answer us in his time. In his time. Habakkuk is an Old Testament prophet. He's a minor prophet. He lived in Judah just before the Babylonian invasion. So he was living in the southern kingdom of Judah, which he was warning, as were other prophets, that, hey, your disobedience is going to cause God to do something radical. And it did. Babylonians invaded and took them captive after destroying the temple. This is serious times. And he's an example of someone who's crying out to God, but he's not hearing the Lord right away. He sees everything deteriorating around him spiritually and even materially, yet he shows trust in God. He shows that he's willing to wait on God, even though he's not getting the answers and seeing the results right away. This is a clear example of faithful regardless, being faithful regardless of what you're hearing and regardless of what you're seeing. And he gives us some advice in 3 of these chapters, and I'm just going to read one verse from each. Chapter 1, he says this: "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen?" It may sound like a complaint, but what he's saying is, I'm longing to hear from you. I'm waiting, I'm longing. You see, when you call upon the Lord and ask him for help or ask him for answers, it's not that he doesn't listen. He always does. But remember that his ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are wiser. And his timing is not our timing. That's why in the 2nd chapter of Habakkuk, he says this in verse 3: "For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come." You see, the vision or the revelation or the answers you're looking for will be given to you at the appointed time. But he says here, though it tarries, wait for it. It will surely come. Sometimes we get impatient like Saul or like David, and we just do our own thing instead of waiting on God. And in Habakkuk's case, in chapter 3, verse 17, things, like I said, are deteriorating around him. Yet he continues not just to wait, but rejoice in the Lord. It says, "Though the fig tree does not bud and there's no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior." Wow. How about us? When things are just nothing going on good in our life, like him. Fig tree, no grapes, no olives, no fields, no sheep in the pen, no cattle. That's what their sustenance was. They have none of it. It basically means when things are going really bad with your job, your finances, your food supply, everything else, we still need to trust God and not do it our own way, find our own way, and not just trust God, but rejoice in him. Even when it's difficult to trust God, let's learn to rely on him and rejoice in the Lord. It's the best thing that we can do, because I want to tell you, not trusting God and relying completely on ourselves and not him is the worst thing that we can do, because it has consequences. So remember his promise. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. So let's all learn to fully trust in God and let's let him direct our lives, and let's not do it ourselves, and let's experience the rewards that he has for us, not the consequences. God bless you.